Every year, tens of thousands of people run a 26-point-to-mile race. They do it for sport, for charity, for personal accomplishment. But why that specific distance? Why the name marathon? Well, the answer takes us back over 2,500 years to a dusty battlefield in ancient Greece, and a hero who ran a race against time. What if I told you that the marathon, one of the most grueling races in the world, was born from a single act of pure desperation? That a long, grueling race was run not for a medal, but for the very survival of a city, a race to save his city, and a journey that would echo through history. This is not just a story about a run. It is a story of one man's sacrifice, a race against time, and a message that changed the course of history forever. This is the legend of Pheidippides and the real origin of the marathon. Welcome to a brand new episode on the Eternal Odyssey, where we journey through timeless tales and boundless imagination. Chapter 1, the Persian Shadow Falls. In the early years of the 5th century BC, the ancient world trembled under the shadow of an empire unlike any that had come before. The Persian Empire, stretching from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Indus River, was a colossus that had swallowed nations whole and turned proud kings into trembling vassals. At its heart sat Darius the Great, the King of Kings, whose very name was whispered with a mixture of awe and terror across 3 continents. From his magnificent palace at Persepolis, with its towering columns and gold-inlaid walls depicting the submission of countless people, Darius ruled over what was arguably the most powerful empire in human history. The Persian war machine was a marvel of organization and brutality. Its core was the Immortals, 10,000 elite warriors whose ranks were immediately filled whenever one fell, maintaining the terrifying illusion of an invincible, undying army. Supporting them were contingents from across the empire, Scythian horse archers whose arrows could darken the sky, Nubian spearmen whose bronze-tipped weapons had tasted victory in a dozen campaigns, and siege engineers whose catapults could reduce the mightiest walls to rubble. But the Empire's greatest weapon was not military, it was psychological. The very sight of Persian banners on the horizon was often enough to open city gates and bring forth tribute-bearing delegations. Kings who had ruled for decades would prostrate themselves before Persian governors, trading their dignity for the promise that their people might be spared the worst excesses of conquest. Into this world of submission and fear, one small corner of the Greek world had dared to raise the banner of defiance. The trouble had begun in Ionia, the wealthy Greek city along the coast of what is now Turkey. These prosperous trading centers, with their magnificent temples and bustling marketplaces, had been Persian subjects for decades. But the spark of Greek independence burned bright in their hearts, and in 499 BC, they had done the unthinkable. They had revolted. The Ionian Rebellion, as it came to be known, might have been just another provincial uprising, quickly crushed and forgotten. But the rebels had made a fateful decision. They had asked for help from their kinsmen across the Aegean Sea, and 2 cities, Athens and Eretria, had answered their call. It was a decision that would echo through history. The Athenians sent 20 ships, the Eretrians 5, pitifully small force by Persian standards, but a provocation that Darius would never forget or forgive. These ships helped the rebels burn Sardis, the magnificent Persian administrative center in Asia Minor. The flames that consumed the city's temples and palaces lit a fire of vengeance in Darius's heart. That would not be extinguished until Athens lay in ruins. The rebellion was doomed from the start. Persian resources were vast, their military experience unmatched, and their determination absolute. City by city, the rebel strongholds fell. Leaders were crucified, populations were enslaved, and the dreams of freedom were drowned in blood. By 494 BC, the last of the rebel cities had fallen, but Darius' appetite for vengeance was far from satisfied. He had not forgotten the Greek cities that had dared to interfere in his empire's affairs. In the great throne room at Persepolis, surrounded by the tribute of 100 nations, the King of Kings made a decision that would change the course of Western civilization. Athens and Eretria would pay for their impertinence. They would be made examples of what happened to those who defied. Persian power, the full might of the empire, would be turned against these upstart Greek cities, and their destruction would serve as a warning to anyone else who might dream of resisting Persian rule. Chapter 2, the city of Athens. Athens, in 490 BC, was a city balanced on the knife's edge between past and future. For centuries, it had been just another Greek city-state, ruled by aristocrats and tyrants, distinguished mainly by its olive groves and silver mines. But in the past generation, something revolutionary had begun to take root in its dusty streets and marble-columned agora. Democracy, the radical idea that common citizens could participate in their own government, was still in its infancy. The reforms of Cleisthenes implemented just 2 decades earlier had begun to transform Athens from an oligarchy into something the world had never seen before, a state where farmers and craftsmen, merchants and soldiers could vote on the laws that governed their lives. It was a dangerous experiment. The old aristocratic families viewed democracy with suspicion and resentment, seeing their traditional privileges eroded by the will of the masses. Neighboring cities watched with a mixture of curiosity and alarm as Athens stumbled toward a new form of government. And in the wider world, kings and tyrants looked upon Athenian democracy as a threat to the natural order of things. But for the citizens of Athens, democracy represented something precious beyond measure, the right to determine their own destiny. In the agora, where Socrates would one day walk and question, heated debates raged about policy and principle. In the ecclesia, the citizens' assembly, thousands of men gathered on the Nix Hill to make decisions that would shape not just their own lives, but the future of their children. This was the Athens that had chosen to help the Ionian rebels, not at the command of a king or tyrant, but through the collective decision of its citizens. It had been a close vote, with fierce arguments on both sides. Some had argued for caution, warning that provoking the Persian Empire was tantamount to suicide. Others had spoken passionately about the duty to help fellow Greeks in their struggle for freedom. In the end, the advocates for intervention had won, and 20 Athenian ships had sailed east to join the rebellion. It had been a decision born of idealism and solidarity. But now, 6 years later, the consequences of that choice were sailing across the Aegean toward them. The physical city of Athens was impressive by the standards of the time, though nothing compared to the grandeur it would achieve in later decades. The Acropolis dominated the skyline, its limestone cliffs crowned with temples that gleamed white in the Mediterranean sun. The most sacred of these was the old temple of Athena, the city's patron goddess, which housed her ancient olive wood statue and the city's most precious treasures. Below the Acropolis, the city spread out in a roughly planned grid of streets and neighborhoods. The agora served as both marketplace and civic center, its colonnaded stoas providing shade for merchants, philosophers, and politicians. Here, citizens gathered to buy and sell, to argue and debate, to conduct the business of democracy. The population of Athens and its surrounding territory, Attica, numbered perhaps 150,000 people, including women, children, and slaves. Of these, roughly 40,000 were adult male citizens who could vote and bear arms. It was these men, who included the farmers and craftsmen, merchants, and aristocrats, who would form the core of the army that would march to Marathon. But first, they had to confront a terrible reality that they were almost completely alone. Chapter 3, The Desperate Embassy. When news reached Athens that a massive Persian fleet was assembling at Samos, just days sailing from the Greek mainland, the city erupted into barely controlled panic. The agora buzzed with frightened conversations as citizens tried to comprehend the magnitude of the threat bearing down on them. The Athenian leadership, led by the seasoned politician and General Miltiades, understood that their city could not hope to stand alone against the might of Persia. Desperate diplomatic missions were dispatched to every major Greek city-state, begging for assistance in the coming struggle. The most crucial embassy was sent to Sparta, the greatest military power in Greece. The Spartans were legendary warriors, their hoplite phalanxes renowned throughout the Mediterranean for their discipline and ferocity. If anyone could stand against the Persian war machine, it was the men who had been trained from childhood to fight and die for their city. The embassy to Sparta was led by some of Athens' most persuasive orators, men who understood that the fate of their city might well depend on their words. They made the journey south to Laconia in record time, driven by desperation and the knowledge that every hour's delay brought the Persian fleet closer to Greek shores. In the austere council chamber of Sparta, before the dual kings and the council of elders, the Athenian ambassadors made their case with passionate eloquence. They spoke of the Persian threat not just to Athens, but to all of Greece. They reminded the Spartans of the ancient bonds between Greek cities, of their shared language, their common gods, their mutual heritage stretching back to the heroes of Troy. The Spartan response was devastating in its cold precision. Yes, they acknowledged the Persian threat was real and serious. Yes, they understood that Athens' fight was ultimately Greece's fight. And yes, they would send aid, but not yet. The Carnia, one of Sparta's most sacred religious festivals, was currently in progress. For 9 days, Spartan law absolutely forbade any military action. The gods demanded this period of celebration and ritual purification, and no earthly threat, however dire, could justify violating divine commandment. The festival would end with the full moon, still several days away. Only then could Spartan warriors take up their bronze-tipped spears and march to Athens' aid. Until that moment, Athens would have to stand alone. The Athenian ambassadors pleaded, argued, and even offered bribes, all to no avail. Spartan law was absolute, and Spartan piety was unshakable. The gods came first. Even if their demands might doom the greatest democracy the world had ever seen, other Greek cities proved even less helpful. Some, terrified of Persian retaliation, flatly refused to provide aid. Others offered token forces too small to make any meaningful difference. A few expressed sympathy, but claimed their own defenses were too weak to spare any soldiers. Only tiny Plataea, Athens' loyal ally, stepped forward with meaningful assistance. The Plataeans could muster only about 1,000 hoplites, but they offered every single one to the Athenian cause. It was a gesture of courage and solidarity that would be remembered long after both cities had passed into legend. As the diplomatic missions returned with their largely disappointing news, the reality of Athens' situation became crystal clear. They would face the Persian Empire with perhaps 11,000 hoplites comprising 10,000 Athenians and 1,000 Plataeans. Against them would come the largest expeditionary force the ancient world had ever seen. Chapter 4, The Man of Iron Will. Among the 10 Athenian generals elected to lead this desperate defense was a man whose very presence seemed to radiate confidence and determination. Miltiades was a paradoxical figure, an aristocrat who had embraced democracy, a veteran of Persian service who would become their greatest enemy, a man whose controversial past had prepared him uniquely for this moment of supreme crisis. Miltiades had not always been a champion of Athenian democracy. 4 years. He had ruled the Thracian Chersonese, modern-day Gallipoli Peninsula, as a virtual tyrant, controlling the vital grain routes that fed Athens and other Greek cities. It was a position that had brought him into close contact with Persian power, and for a time, he had served as a Persian vassal, even participating in Darius's disastrous campaign against the Scythians. But the Ionian Rebellion had changed everything, as Persian control tightened and Greek independence vanished. Midiatus had seen the writing on the wall. He had abandoned his territory, barely escaping Persian vengeance, and returned to Athens as a refugee from his former life. His homecoming had been anything but triumphant. Political enemies accused him of tyranny and treason. Legal proceedings were begun to determine whether his years as a Persian ally made him unfit for Athenian citizenship. For a time, it seemed that one of Greece's most experienced military commanders might be exiled or executed, just when his expertise was most desperately needed. But democracy, for all its chaos and inefficiency, sometimes produced remarkable results. As the Persian threat grew more urgent, Athenian citizens began to recognize that Midiatus' controversial past was actually an asset. Who better to fight the Persians than a man who understood their military methods, their strengths and weaknesses, their strategic thinking? The charges against Midiatus were quietly dropped, and he was elected as one of the 10 generals for 490 BC. It was a decision that would prove crucial to the survival of Greek independence. Midiatus brought to his new position not just military experience, but psychological insight into Persian methods. He understood that the Persian Empire relied heavily on intimidation and the threat of overwhelming force. Their standard tactic was to deploy such massive armies that resistance seemed hopeless, often winning battles before they were fought through the sheer psychological impact of their numbers. But Midiatus had also seen Persian weaknesses during his years in their service. The empire's vast size was both a strength and a vulnerability. Persian armies were composed of contingents from dozens of different nations, with varying levels of motivation and military effectiveness. Communication between units could be problematic, and command structures were often cumbersome and inflexible. Most importantly, Midiatus understood that Persian forces, for all their reputation, were not invincible. They were men like any others, capable of fear, confusion, and defeat. The key was to create conditions where their advantages in numbers and cavalry could be minimized, while maximizing the strengths of Greek hoplite tactics. As reports filtered in about the Persian landing at Marathon, Midiatus began to formulate a plan that would either save Athens or see it destroyed in a glorious final stand. But first, the Athenian army had to reach the battlefield. Chapter 5, The March to Destiny. The call to arms echoed through every deme and district of Attica. From the bustling neighborhoods of Athens itself to the remote farming villages, scattered across the countryside, Athenian citizens gathered their bronze-tipped spears, their round hoplon shields, and their bronze helmets, and prepared to march. The hoplite citizen soldier was the backbone of Greek military power. Unlike the professional warriors of other nations, these men were farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and landowners who had learned the arts of war as a civic duty. Their equipment was expensive. A full panoply of armor and weapons could cost as much as a small farm. But it was this personal investment that made them so formidable. Each hoplite carried a large round shield, roughly 3 feet in diameter, made of bronze-covered wood with a distinctive concave shape that could deflect arrows. And spear thrusts. Their primary weapon was a long spear, 8 to 10 feet in length, with a bronze point designed to punch through armor. For close combat, they carried short swords, and their bodies were protected by bronze breastplates, greaves on their shins, and helmets that covered most of their heads. But the hoplites' greatest weapon was not individual equipment, it was the phalanx formation. When properly deployed, hundreds of heavily armored men would lock their shields together in an overlapping wall, with their spears projecting forward in a deadly hedge of bronze points. This formation was nearly invulnerable to frontal assault, and could punch through almost any opposing force. The key word was properly deployed. The phalanx required extensive training, discipline, and mutual trust. Each man depended on his neighbors to maintain the formation and protect his flanks. A single gap in the line could lead to catastrophic collapse as enemy forces poured through the opening to attack the hoplites from behind where their armor was weakest. As the Athenian army assembled, these citizen soldiers carried with them more than just weapons and armor. They bore the hopes and fears of their families, the weight of democratic ideals, and the knowledge that defeat would mean the end of everything they held dear. The march from Athens to Marathon took the better part of a day, covering roughly 25 miles of rough terrain. The army moved in column formation along the ancient road that connected Athens to the coastal plain, their bronze equipment glinting in the Mediterranean sun, their steady pace eating up the miles that separated them from their date with destiny. At the head of the column rode the 10 generals, elected representatives of the Athenian people who would collectively command the army. According to Athenian democratic practice, these generals rotated daily command, ensuring that no single man could accumulate too much power. It was a system designed to prevent tyranny, but it could prove disastrous in the fluid conditions of battle. Pheidippides, however, had already begun the delicate political work of convincing his fellow generals that the coming battle would require unified command and bold tactics. He understood that the Persian forces at Marathon had been carefully positioned to maximize their advantages, and that conventional Greek tactics would likely result in catastrophic defeat. As the Athenian column crested the final ridge and caught their first glimpse of the Marathon plain spread out before them, even the most optimistic soldiers must have felt their hearts sink. The Persian camp stretched as far as the eye could see, a vast city of tents and supply wagons protected by a crescent-shaped line of warships drawn up on the beach. Smoke from thousands of cooking fires darkened the sky, while the distant sound of foreign languages and unfamiliar music carried on the wind. Most ominously, herds of Persian cavalry horses grazed in the plain's center, a stark reminder that the enemy possessed a weapon for which the Greeks had no effective counter. This was the moment of truth. The Athenian army, perhaps 10,000 strong, faced a Persian force at least twice their size, backed by a fleet that could land additional reinforcements at will. The sensible course would have been to retreat to defensive positions and wait for Spartan reinforcements. But Pheidippides had already recognized that retreat would be tantamount to defeat. The Persians could simply bypass the Athenian army and sail directly to the undefended city. If Athens was to be saved, the enemy had to be fought here and now, against overwhelming odds. With little hope of victory, it was time for heroes to be born. Chapter 6, The Chess Game of War. For 5 days, the two armies faced each other across the Marathon plain in a tense standoff that tested nerves and strategy in equal measure. Neither side seemed willing to make the first move, but beneath this apparent stalemate, both commanders were playing a complex game of military chess. The Persian strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Dodus and Artapins, the twin commanders of the expedition, had positioned their forces to maximize their natural advantages, while minimizing Greek strengths. The broad, flat plain was perfect for their feared cavalry, which could sweep around the flanks of any Greek formation and attack the hoplites where their heavy armor was most vulnerable, from behind and on the sides. The Persian battle line stretched across the plain in a magnificent display of imperial might. At the center stood the immortals, their scale armor gleaming, their tall spears topped with golden pomegranates that marked them as the elite of the elite. Their very name struck fear into enemies whenever one of their number fell. Another immediately took his place, maintaining the illusion of an undying, invincible force. On either flank of the immortals stood contingents from across the Persian Empire, Saka archers from the steppes of Central Asia, whose composite bows could drive arrows through bronze armor at incredible distances. Thracian peltas with their light shields and javelins, perfect for harassment and pursuit. Indian infantry with their bamboo spears and hide shields. Veterans of campaigns in the subcontinent's blazing heat. But the most terrifying component of the Persian army was its cavalry, nearly 1,000 horsemen, drawn from the finest riders in the empire, weighted in the plain's center like coiled springs. These were not simply mounted infantry, but true cavalry, men who had learned to ride before they could walk, whose arrows could find their mark at full gallop, who could appear and disappear like ghosts on the battlefield. Against this overwhelming display of force, the Athenian army seemed pitifully small. Their 10,000 hoplites, reinforced by 1,000 brave Plataeans, formed a thin line that barely stretched across a fraction of the Persian front. They had no cavalry, no archers worthy of the name, and no allies except for their Plataean comrades. But Midiatus understood something that the Persian commanders did not. Sometimes apparent weakness could be transformed into strength by audacity and innovative tactics. During the long days of standoff, Midiatus had been studying the Persian deployment with the eye of a master strategist. He had served in Persian armies, had observed their methods firsthand, and he understood both their capabilities and their limitations. Most importantly, he had begun to formulate a plan so audacious, so contrary to conventional military wisdom, that it might just succeed through sheer unexpectedness. The key insight was this: the Persian army, for all its size and diversity, was designed to fight enemies who would try to match them strength for strength. Their standard opponents would deploy a heavy center to meet the immortals, leaving their flanks vulnerable to cavalry attack. Once the flanks collapsed, the Persian cavalry and light infantry would surround the enemy center and complete their destruction. Midiatus proposed to turn this expectation upside down. Instead of massing his forces in the center, he would deliberately weaken the Athenian middle while strengthening the flanks. If executed correctly, this would allow the Greek wings to defeat their opponents and then turn inward to surround them. Persian center, using the enemy's own tactical success against them. It was a plan that violated every principle of conservative military science. Deliberately, weakening your center against elite enemy forces seemed like suicide. But Midiatus had observed something crucial. The Persian cavalry, for all their reputation, had not been aggressively patrolling or skirmishing during the standoff. This suggested they might be preparing to embark for a direct assault on Athens, leaving the plain army temporarily weakened. On the morning of the 6th day, Midiatus scouts confirmed his suspicions. Much of the Persian cavalry had indeed been loaded aboard ships for a direct attack on Athens. The Persian commanders had apparently decided that the Athenian army was too cowardly to offer battle, and that they could safely divide their forces. It was the opportunity Midiatus had been waiting for. That evening, he called together the council of generals and made his case with passionate conviction. Tomorrow, he argued, they must attack. The Persian cavalry was reduced, their attention was divided, and their confidence might make them careless. It was their only chance, and it had to be taken regardless of the odds. The debate that followed was fierce and emotional. Conservative generals argued that attack was tantamount to suicide, that they should wait for Spartan reinforcements, or fall back to defensive positions round Athens. But Midiatus' force of personality and strategic arguments gradually won over his colleagues. By a narrow margin, the council voted to give Miltiades supreme command and to attack at dawn. Chapter 7, The Runner in the Dawn. Among the Athenian forces preparing for battle was a man whose name would echo through history in ways he could never have imagined. Pheidippides was not a general or a politician, but something equally valuable to the Athenian war effort. A hemerodromos, a professional long-distance runner who served as a military messenger. In an age before electronic communication, the hemerodromos filled a crucial military role. These men were selected for their extraordinary physical endurance and their ability to cover vast distances on foot in minimal time. They carried messages between armies, cities, and commanders, often racing against time to deliver information that could determine the outcome of campaigns. Pheidippides was among the best of his profession. In the days before the Marathon campaign, he had already distinguished himself by running to Sparta with Athens' request for aid, a journey of roughly 150 miles that he had completed in just 2 days. His failure to secure immediate Spartan assistance was no reflection on his efforts. He had delivered the message as requested and returned with the disappointing but crucial intelligence about Spartan religious obligations. Now, as the Athenian army prepared for battle, Pheidippides faced a different kind of mission. He was assigned to the crucial task of battlefield communication, ready to carry messages between different parts of the Athenian line or to race back to Athens. With news of the battle's outcome, the pre-battle preparations were both solemn and practical. Hoplites checked their equipment one final time, ensuring that spear points were sharp, shield grips were secure, and armor straps were properly adjusted. Officers moved through the ranks, offering words of encouragement and reminding their men of what they were fighting for: their homes, their families, their freedom, and the revolutionary idea that free citizens could govern themselves. Religious ceremonies played an important role in these preparations. Sacrifices were offered to Athena, the city's patron goddess, and to Ars, the god of war. Priests examined the entrails of sacrificial animals, looking for omens that might predict the battle's outcome. The signs, according to later accounts, were favorable, though whether this was genuine divine favor or simply the interpretation that anxious soldiers needed to hear remains unclear. As dawn approached, the Athenian battle line began to take its final form. Miltiades' radical plan was put into effect. The center was deliberately thinned to just a few ranks deep, while the wings were strengthened with additional troops. The overall line was extended to match the Persian front, preventing the enemy from simply outflanking the Greek position. The most experienced and reliable troops were placed on the flanks, where the battle's outcome would likely be decided. The center, though weakened, was given to brave men who understood that their job was to hold long enough for the flanks to succeed, even if that holding action cost them their lives. Pheidippides took his position near the command group, ready to carry messages wherever they might be needed. His running gear was light, but practical: a short tunic, leather sandals designed for rough terrain, and a water gourd that could sustain him through hours of exertion. He carried no weapons save a short knife, relying on speed rather than strength for survival. As the sun crested the mountains to the east, both armies began their final preparations for battle. The Persians, confident in their numerical superiority and tactical advantages, formed their traditional battle line with the immortals in the center and supporting troops on the flanks. They seemed almost casual in their preparations, perhaps expecting another day of standoff rather than serious combat. The Athenians, by contrast, moved with the desperate energy of men who knew this might be their last morning on Earth. Every gesture was deliberate, every prayer fervent, every glance toward home potentially final. Miltiades walked the length of his battle line, speaking briefly with unique commanders and offering personal encouragement to nervous soldiers. His presence was magnetic. Here was a man who had served in Persian armies, who understood the enemy's capabilities, who had chosen to stake everything on this single throw of the dice. Men of Athens, his voice carried across the ranks. Today we fight not just for our city, but for the idea that free men can determine their own destiny. The Persians think we are weak because we are few, cowardly because we are not slaves to a king. Let us show them the strength that comes from fighting for something greater than ourselves. The moment had arrived. With the sun now fully above the horizon, Midiatus raised his spear and gave the command that would echo through eternity. Advance. Chapter 8, The Charge That Shook the World. What happened next defied everything the ancient world understood about warfare. Instead of the traditional slow, steady advance that conserved energy for the crucial moment of contact, Midiatus ordered his hoplites to charge, to run at full speed across nearly a mile of open ground directly into the teeth of the Persian battle line. It was tactical madness that bordered on insanity. Heavily armored men were not supposed to run long distances. The weight of their equipment would exhaust them before they reached the enemy. A charging formation would lose cohesion, arriving piecemeal and vulnerable. Most dangerously, running men could not maintain the tight shield wall that was the hoplite phalanx's greatest strength. But Midiatus had calculated that shock and speed might overcome these disadvantages. The Persians were accustomed to enemies who approached cautiously, allowing time for arrow volleys to weaken and demoralize attacking forces. A headlong charge would minimize the time under missile fire and might catch the enemy off guard. More importantly, the charge would serve psychological purposes on both sides. For the Greeks, it would transform nervous energy into aggressive momentum, turning fear into fury. For the Persians, the sight of apparently crazed Greeks running straight into certain death might create just enough confusion and hesitation to disrupt their defensive preparations. The sound of 11,000 men charging across the marathon plain must have been thunderous. The clash of bronze equipment, the rhythmic pounding of feet against hard-packed earth, and above all, the war cries that had echoed across Greek battlefields for centuries. Alala, they shouted, invoking the god of war, their voices joining in a roar that could be heard miles away. Persian archers released their arrows in dense volleys, darkening the sky with thousands of bronze-tipped shafts. Many found their mark, and Greek soldiers stumbled and fell along the charge's path. But the range was closing too quickly for sustained archery, and most of the Greeks reached the Persian line intact. The collision, when it came, was catastrophic. Bronze spear points punched through Persian armor, while Persian weapons sought gaps in Greek defenses. The air filled with the crash of metal on metal, the screams of wounded men, and the shouted orders of officers trying to maintain control in the chaos of melee combat. Midiatus' tactical gamble began to pay dividends almost immediately. On the Greek right wing, where some of Athens' most experienced warriors had been concentrated, the Persian flank began to buckle under the ferocious assault. These Persian troops, many of them subject people fighting for a foreign king, lacked the desperate motivation that drove the Greek citizen soldiers. The Plataean contingent, fighting on the Greek left, proved their worth by matching their Athenian allies' ferocity. Though vastly outnumbered by their Persian opponents, they held their section of the line through sheer courage and determination, proving that the bonds of Greek solidarity could overcome even significant disparities in numbers. But in the center, where Midiatus had deliberately weakened his forces, the plan was working almost too well. The Persian immortals, elite troops with decades of combat experience, were slowly pushing back the thin Greek line. The Athenian center began to bend, then bow, then threaten to break entirely. This was the most critical moment of the battle. If the Greek center collapsed completely, The immortals could roll up the flanks and turn Midiatis' tactical innovation into a catastrophic defeat. Everything depended on whether the Greek wings could complete their own victories before the center disintegrated. Pheidippides, positioned near the command post, watched this life and death drama unfold with the trained eye of a military professional. He could see the Persian center advancing inexorably, driving back the brave men who had been asked to sacrifice themselves for the greater tactical plan. He could also see the Greek flanks beginning to curve inward as they defeated their immediate opponents and prepared to turn against the Persian center. It was a race between destruction and salvation, with the fate of Western civilization hanging in the balance. The next few minutes would determine whether Midiatis was a brilliant tactician or a reckless gambler who had doomed his city to slavery. Chapter 9, The Miracle of Marathon. The turning point came suddenly and decisively on both flanks. The Greek wings completed their destruction of their Persian opponents and began the complex maneuver that would transform tactical success into strategic victory. With drill ground precision that seemed impossible amid the chaos of battle, the victorious hoplites turned inward and began advancing toward the rear of the Persian center. The immortals, for all their reputation and experience, suddenly found themselves in an impossible position. They had been pushing forward successfully against the weakened Greek center, but now they were being attacked from behind by fresh troops whose blood was up from recent victory. The elite Persian formation, which had seemed on the verge of breakthrough, was now trapped in a closing vice. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Persian troops, who had been confident of victory just moments before, now faced the terrifying prospect of encirclement. The fear that ran through their ranks was almost palpable. These men had joined the expedition, expecting easy conquest, not desperate fighting against apparently suicidal opponents. The collapse, when it came, was sudden and complete. The Persian center, caught between three converging Greek forces, began to disintegrate. What had been a disciplined military formation became a mob of frightened men seeking escape. Some tried to fight their way out, others simply ran, and still others threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Midiatis' impossible gamble had paid off. The tactical masterpiece was complete. The Persians' greatest strength had been turned against them. Their elite troops surrounded and destroyed. Their army routed by a force less than half their size. But even as victory became apparent, Midiatis and his officers understood that the greater strategic situation remained perilous. The routed Persian army was falling back toward their ships, and those ships represented both an escape route for the defeated expedition and a continuing threat to Athens itself. The Persian fleet had not been idle during the land battle. While the armies clashed on the plain, Persian naval commanders had been preparing for their own assault on Athens. Ships loaded with cavalry and elite infantry were already sailing around Cape Saunion, intending to strike at the undefended city while its army was engaged at Marathon. This was the moment that would test not just Greek military prowess, but Greek endurance and determination. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Athens needed to know immediately about the victory at Marathon, but more importantly, the city needed to prepare for the naval assault that was already underway. Someone had to carry word to Athens, and that someone had to run faster than human endurance should allow. The distance was roughly 25 miles of rough, mountainous terrain. The runner would be racing against Persian ships that could cover the same distance. In a fraction of the time, as the routed Persian army streamed toward their ships and the victorious Greeks began the grim task of pursuit and cleanup, Midiatis made the decision that would create one of history's most enduring legends. Pheidippides! He called to the professional runner who had remained close to the command group throughout the battle. The city must know of our victory, and they must prepare immediately for the Persian fleet. Can you reach Athens before the ships? Round the cape, Pheidippides looked toward the west, where the road to Athens wound through hills and valleys that he knew intimately from years of professional running. The distance was daunting, the terrain challenging, and he was already tired from the stress and minor exertions of the battle. But he also understood that the fate of Athens, and perhaps all of Greece, depended on his ability to cover those 25 miles faster than he had ever run before. "I will reach the city," he replied simply, and without further ceremony, he began to run. Chapter 10, The Race Against Time. The run from Marathon to Athens was unlike anything Pheidippides had ever attempted in his career as a heterodromos. He had covered greater distances, but never under such pressure, never with so much at stake, and never after the physical and emotional stress of witnessing one of history's most decisive battles. The route itself presented numerous challenges. The direct path led through the foothills of Mount Pentelicus, over rough terrain that rose and fell in exhausting succession. The road was little more than a track in many places, worn smooth by countless feet and cartwheels, but treacherous for a runner pushing himself to the absolute limits of human endurance. For the first few miles, Pheidippides felt strong and confident. The adrenaline from the morning's victory carried him forward at a pace that would have been impressive under any circumstances. The sun, still relatively low in the eastern sky, provided warmth without the crushing heat that would come later in the day. But as the miles accumulated and the terrain became more challenging, the true magnitude of his task began to assert itself. His breathing became labored. His legs began to feel the accumulated strain, and the weight of his responsibility pressed down on him like a physical burden. With each step, Pheidippides was racing not just against time, but against the Persian fleet. In his mind's eye, he could visualize the enemy ships rounding Cape Saunion and beginning their approach to Piraeus, Athens' port. The winds were favorable for sailing, which meant the Persians might reach the city only hours after he did, if he reached it at all. The psychological pressure was enormous. Pheidippides understood that his fellow citizens were probably going about their daily routines, unaware that their army had won a miraculous victory, but equally unaware that a new threat was already approaching by sea. Children were playing in the streets, merchants were conducting business in the agora, and politicians were debating in the assembly, all while Persian warships prepared to deliver death and slavery to their doorsteps. As the run progressed, Pheidippides began to experience the peculiar mixture of exhaustion and transcendence that comes to endurance athletes pushed beyond their normal limits. His body screamed for rest, for water, for relief from the relentless pounding of foot against stone. But his mind, focused entirely on his mission, seemed to exist in a separate realm where physical discomfort was merely background noise. The hills that rose before him became enemies to be conquered. The rough stones that threatened to turn his ankles became obstacles to be overcome through pure determination. The burning in his lungs became a fire that drove him forward rather than a weakness that might slow him down. Around the halfway point of his journey, as he crested a particularly challenging rise, Pheidippides caught his first glimpse of Athens in the distance. The Acropolis shimmered in the morning heat, its marble temples catching and reflecting the sun's rays like beacons of hope. The sight gave him renewed strength and reminded him viscerally of what he was running to save. But the view also revealed something ominous. On the horizon beyond Athens, he could see dark specks that might have been Persian ships. The race was even closer than he had feared, and every minute of delay could prove catastrophic. Pheidippides pushed himself harder, drawing on reserves of strength and willpower that he didn't know he possessed. His professional pride as a heterodromos was at stake, but more importantly, the survival of everything he held dear depended on his ability to maintain this punishing pace 4 miles more. The final stretch of the run took him through familiar territory, the outskirts of Athens, where he had trained, the suburbs where friends and neighbors lived their daily lives in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding around them. Every landmark was a milestone towards success, but also a reminder of how much he stood to lose if he failed. Chapter 11, the message that saved a city. By the time Pheidippides reached the outskirts of Athens, he was running on pure willpower. His body had long since passed the point of normal exhaustion, entering that strange realm where the spirit drives the flesh beyond what should be physically possible. His vision was beginning to blur, his coordination was suffering, and every breath was a conscious effort. But he could see his destination clearly now, the Agora, the heart of Athenian democracy, where citizens would be gathering for the morning's business. If he could reach that central space and deliver his message, the city might yet be saved. The streets of Athens had never seemed so long or so challenging. Every step required conscious effort, every slight incline felt like a mountain, and the weight of his own body seemed to increase with each passing moment. Yet still he ran, driven by a sense of purpose that transcended physical limitation. Citizens began to notice the approaching figure, a lone runner, clearly in distress, moving with desperate urgency through their streets. Some called out questions, others pointed and stared, but Pheidippides had no breath to spare for explanations. His entire being was focused on a single goal: reach the Agora and deliver his message before collapse became inevitable. As he entered the central square of Athens, a crowd began to gather. The sight of a hemerdromos arriving in such obvious distress could only mean news of the highest importance, either victory or catastrophic defeat at Marathon. The assembled citizens fell silent, their faces tense with anticipation and dread. Pheidippides staggered into the center of the Agora, his legs finally beginning to give out beneath him. The crowd pressed closer, recognizing that they were about to witness a moment of historic significance. In the sudden silence, the only sounds were Pheidippides' labored breathing and the distant noise of normal city life. Continuing beyond the square, with his last reserves of strength, Pheidippides straightened himself as much as possible and delivered the message that would echo through eternity. Nike, he gasped, using the Greek word for victory. We have conquered. The crowd erupted in celebration. But Pheidippides was not finished. With tremendous effort, he forced out additional words that were equally crucial to Athens' survival. The fleet comes by sea. Prepare. These final words were perhaps more important than the announcement of victory. The Battle of Marathon was won, but the war was not over. Persian ships were indeed approaching Athens with fresh troops, and only immediate preparation could prevent the naval assault from succeeding where the land attack had failed. Having delivered his complete message, Pheidippides felt the last of his strength ebb away. He had accomplished what he set out to do. Athens knew of their victory and was warned of the continuing danger. His mission was complete. According to the most dramatic versions of the legend, Pheidippides collapsed and died on the spot, his heart giving out from the superhuman effort he had sustained. Whether this detail is historically accurate or a later embellishment, it captures the essence of ultimate sacrifice. A man who gave everything he had, including his life, to save his city and his fellow citizens. Chapter 12, the second victory. The warning delivered by Pheidippides proved crucial to Athens' ultimate salvation. Within minutes of receiving word about the Persian fleet's approach, the city's leaders sprang into action with the efficiency that democratic urgency could sometimes provide. Messengers were dispatched to recall every available man to the city's defense. The walls were manned, weapons were distributed, and hasty preparations were made to resist a siege if necessary. Most importantly, lookouts were posted to watch for the approaching Persian ships. and for the return of the Athenian army from Marathon. The Persian naval commanders, confident that they would find Athens undefended and demoralized, sailed into the Bay of Phaleron expecting easy conquest. Instead, they found the city's walls bristling with defenders and clear evidence that their approach had been anticipated. But the real shock came when the Persian ship's lookout spotted dust clouds on the road from Marathon. The Athenian army, despite having fought a major battle just hours earlier, was making a forced march back to their city. Pheidippides had understood immediately that the land victory would be meaningless if the Persian fleet succeeded in taking Athens.
So he had ordered his exhausted troops to cover the same 25 miles that Pheidippides had run.
The sight of the returning Athenian army was devastating to Persian morale. These ships' crews had expected to find a defeated enemy and an undefended city. Instead, they faced the victors of Marathon, men whose confidence had been boosted by their impossible victory and whose determination had been hardened. Faced with a now impregnable city, a triumphant and battle-hardened army, and the realization that their element of surprise was gone, the Persian commanders knew their mission had failed. They had no choice but to retreat. The immense fleet, which had sailed into the Bay of Phaleron with such arrogance, turned and began to sail away. The Athenians watched from their walls as the enemy ships disappeared on the horizon. The victory was complete, Athens was saved, and the legend of the Marathon was sealed. The story of the battle and the subsequent race to defend the city became a symbol of Athenian resolve and the power of a people united against a seemingly insurmountable foe. It was this victory that laid the groundwork for the future glory of Athens and the Hellenic world. The victory at Marathon was a monumental event for the Athenians. It was the first time a Greek city-state had successfully repelled a Persian invasion. The victory proved that the Persians, the greatest empire of their time, were not invincible. This triumph fueled immense civic pride and confidence in Athens. The swift return of the Athenian army after the battle, which was the actual historical event, successfully defended the city against the Persian fleet and solidified their victory. This demonstration of military prowess and strategic speed was a turning point for Athens. The most significant legacy is the creation of the marathon race. When the first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens in 1896, the organizers wanted to create an event that would honor Greek history. French academic Michel Brial suggested a race commemorating the legendary run of Pheidippides. The original distance was set at approximately 25 miles, the distance between Marathon and Athens. The modern 26.219 miles standard distance for the marathon was set by the International Amateur Athletic Federation, IAAF, in May 1921. So the legend goes, one man's extraordinary act of courage became the blueprint for the most iconic foot race in the world. The next time you hear about a marathon, remember it's more than a race. It's a 26.2-mile tribute to a hero who ran his last desperate race, not for glory, but to save a city. If you're intrigued by these epic tales, make sure you like this video, share it with a fellow history buff, and subscribe to the Eternal Odyssey for more journeys into the most incredible stories from the past. Thank you.